film special interest group sessions. So, Sarah.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. And yeah, I'm really excited to learn about, how other people teach colour and, these issues that we would have all come across about the difficulties, but also, how great it can be. So while research into colour has grown in the last 20 years, and many of us have presented our research at conferences, etc., and we have our network, I think there's been far less attention to how we're embedding it into our teaching and curricula. So the idea for the session is to share ideas and examples of our teaching practices to illustrate why teaching colour is important and what can be gained. Putting colour into the curriculum at all levels, I think, is a great way to get students interested, and some of them might then want to go on to do more advanced research into postgraduate degrees, and of course other areas too, where I'm sure it is really useful. But teaching colour isn't always straightforward, as I'm sure some of us in our different ways will bring up. So we're going to be asking, I think, what are the challenges, what are the advantages, and in particular, which themes and contexts kind of lend themselves to promoting colour studies. So I think we hope that this session will start a conversation about how we can best share teaching practices involving colour. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's presentations and also the discussion. And thanks, Liz, for saying yes to the idea.
Thank you. So I'll briefly introduce our first speaker. After all 5 speakers, we'll go to a question and answer kind of session for a discussion. So prepare your questions whilst we're listening. So our first speaker is Professor Joshua Yumibe, Professor of Film at Michigan State University. His research focuses on aesthetic and technological history of cinema, avant-garde and experimental cinemas, 19th and early 20th century visual culture, Frankfurt School theory, and archival theories and practices. His publications include Moving Colour, Early Film, Mass Culture and Modernism, Fantasia of Colour in Early Cinema, and Chromatic Modernity, which was co-authored with Sarah Street and published in 2019. There's a second book coming out soon on Eastman colour and global thought. So I will hand over to Josh, who will today be speaking about teaching colour as race and hue in a global context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you for coordinating this really fantastic conversation. I'm actually prepping a new version of a color cinema course for the fall, and so I'm excited to get some collective ideas going on here around teaching color. Also, I should say that I'm presenting from a classroom now, just before a film history class that I'm teaching this afternoon here this semester, and some of my students are watching the workshop with us off camera, but thanks to you all for being flexible this week with our conversations. So I guess I'll just begin by saying that, I've been teaching color courses for a long time. And every few years I teach one. But the first one I taught was as a graduate student at the University of Chicago when I taught it there for the first time, I think in the winter of 2006. And then I've taught a version of this class every few years, basically at every institution that I've been involved with. In some ways, the course has stayed the same. It's an investigation of color style, aesthetics, technology, and culture in the moving image that begins with experimental cinema, color music, and abstract media, and then shifts gears and moves very chronologically in many ways, from silent cinema to contemporary film and media. But the course has, of course, changed over the years and in ways here and there. And I wanted to talk a little bit about recent experiences teaching color and color in the moving image that are making me rethink this class more systematically for the upcoming fall. Now, first off, for context, I was super fortunate to be on sabbatical last year, and I had a visiting position at the University of Turin in the spring and taught a master's level version of my color cinema course there, which was, absolutely fantastic experience. Turin's a second home for me in many ways, and the students there were excellent, as are my colleagues at the university, Jaime Alonge and Sabrina Negri in particular. I was also able to program a public screening series that tied into the course in conjunction with the National Museum of Cinema there, Il Museo Nazionale del Cinema, through their Cinema Massimo. And all around, this was just a amazing, fantastic, wonderful, obviously, experience there in the shadow of the Mole Antonelliana in Turin. But now, an issue that came to the fore increasingly in that class is something that has also been on my mind as of late. That is the ways in which color is entwined with race and ethnicity in the moving image. This is in part inspired by the inspiring work of Kirsty Sinclair Dootson, who's here and will be speaking shortly. And in a nutshell, her framing of color, race, in the moving image, drawing from Linda Need's own wondrous work, relates to the ways in which color as a hue overlaps, informs, and is informed by our cultural understandings of color as race, color as a racial marker, as in the color of one's skin, people of color, and all that this entails, which is a lot. Color in relation to race hasn't been a blind spot in the collective work on color in the moving image over the last 25 years. So many of us working in this field have been spurred on by the works of David Batchelor and Michael Taussig, amongst others, who've written incisively about the confluences of color, race, and colonialism in a broader context. I'm thinking, here of Sarah Street's study of Black Narcissus as a text that foregrounds these issues. And this has been a topic in my own work to an extent, but color and race have not yet been fully centered and plumbed in the way that it needs to be with regards to the moving image. But fantastic work is coming out along these lines. Kirsty's expansive work about color and British modernity, and the work of Jin Peng, and I'm thinking of her really excellent essay on Toll of the Sea, and then also in Lida, Zeitlin-Wu's excellent work on color standards, and we'll be hearing from her in a little bit as well. So to think about color, race, and the moving image with regards to teaching and pedagogy, it was a really special opportunity to begin to examine some of these issues with my students in Turin, traversing linguistic as well as national boundaries. There's always something about being outside of one's routine surroundings that opens up new perspectives, and I took the opportunity there to program Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust for my students. It's a film that I've been thinking about and writing about lately, and it's, a really famous film where there is lots of fantastic work that's been done on it. And with regards to color, it's an obvious choice for a course on color and cinema. But it also brings a contextual foreignness to students in Italy, given its specificity, famous for its depiction of a matriarchal family, the Pezants, who are Gula plantation descendants of enslaved West Africans on the sea islands off of the coast of Georgia in the early 1900s. The film recounts their final days at Ibo Landing as they gather and prepare to move to the mainland. But this specificity, in fact, needs to be contextualized for most U.S. students as well. Here in Michigan, few of my students know about African American Gula culture of the American coastal South. But for students in Turin, as well as in East Lansing, the film still offers so much in terms of thinking through the legacies of colonialism, plantation slavery, the color and trade, and color technologies. Daughters of the Dust is of course a film lush with color through its costuming, set designs, and remarkable cinematography by Arthur Jaffa. We talked of all of this in my class in Turin, but what was of particular interest to a number of the students was thinking through the technologies of color in the film, specifically its recreation of indigo production when Dash famously flashes back in the film to show the Pezants family's enslaved ancestors processing it on the plantation, stirring boiling vats of dye, coloring fabric, and shaping dyestuffs into molds. Enslaved West Africans were used to process indigo in the New World specifically because they brought native expertise from working with the colorant in Africa. But as Dash has noted this, and this is a quote from her, African practice became poisonous when transferred to the New World, end of the quote, due to the exploitation of chattel slavery and the transatlantic plantation economy. Coupled with this colonial slave history, the film also offered my students insight into the very racial biases of film technology itself. Dash has commented on how she and Jaffa filmed the work on Agfa Gavart film negative, but due to budgetary constraints, they had to make release prints on Kodak Eastman color stock without properly color grading for this transition. which in part led to a murkiness in the original colors when it was released. The problem also went beyond poor analog grading to the very stocks themselves. As Dash contends, Agfa Gevart reproduces black skin tones better as it, quote, reads warm in the shadow areas. Kodak film stock is blue-green in shadows. It reads black people as shadows, so they look blue or green. End of her quote on this. This is something that she and Jafa were able to correct on the recent 2K digital restoration of the film, enhancing the vibrancy of the hues as they had originally intended, allowing the new prints to capture the variety of African American skin tones present in that film. Now, my students were both struck by this history of various technologies of color, from indigo to film stocks themselves, replete as they are with colonial roots and racial biases. But also much of this conversation with my students around the film centered on what filmmakers of color have done so remarkably well in works like Daughters of the Dust, to reclaim color and use it politically and aesthetically in ways that articulate new possibilities for the moving image. It's these questions about technical racial biases as well as creative interventions that I aim to center in the restructured version of the course that I'm planning this coming fall here at Michigan State University. So that's all of my kind of opening remarks, and I'm super excited to hear from everybody else who is coming up on this workshop. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. That's a fascinating start. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. I will introduce our next speaker, who is it's Professor Sarah Street, who is Professor of Film and Foundation Chair of Drama at the University of Bristol. Her main areas of research are British cinema history and the contemporary film industry, its politics and economics, British film genres, costume and cinema, set design, and colour film. So her recent books include Pinewood Anatomy of Film Studio in Post-War Britain, which was literally out this week or this month, and which is open access. So that's fantastic. It's online, which was so, and the forthcoming book on global film, Colour and the Monopack Revolution at Mid-Century, which is edited by Sarah and by Joshua Yumibe. It's with Rutgers University Press and will be published in May 2024. Today, Sarah's presentation will discuss how to include practice in teaching colour. So what are the challenges, what is gained through practical application of ideas and concepts taught more broadly on each module.
Okay, thank you. Liz, is everybody seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
Great, fantastic. So yes, I was quite a bit of a dilemma what to choose as the main image, but I thought that one did the job. Okay, so the example I got is a unit. We call them units in Bristol, so excuse the kind of terminology, and it's called Screen Technologies Colour. And so it's got sorry, yeah. Okay, so it's a unit is a generic one, so it's screen technology. So in any year, people can do sound or lighting, they can focus on one particular element. And so I choose color. And it involves lectures, seminars, and practical work. And what I wanted to foreground today was the fact that it also involves practical work involving making short films, or if students like video essays, which I think are great ways to explore the theme, both academically and creatively. And I'm lucky enough to be in a department that can offer the support and the expertise to be able to sort of encompass that within a course on colour, whereas my own sort of training would be for a more, traditional kind of landscape. So so it involves these particularly short films and lesser so, but become in the past, but increasingly important video essays, which I think are a great expressive sort of way for students to get involved. So basically it's a second year undergraduate unit, which I've been teaching. And as it says here, sorry, this is a bit of a kind of catalogue speak, but it does sort of say what it aims to do. It surveys and analyses the aesthetic and technological history of colour cinema, fairly traditional from silent period to contemporary trends. And because of my own interests, I try to include as much as possible cinema's relation to other colour media, and to aesthetic debates in fields of philosophy, art history, film and literature, you know, within reasonable boundaries, for a second year course. But I think it's really important to include that stuff about the perceptual effects and cultural influences of colour. So, you know, I aim to get the students to read films from the perspective of colour, looking at their influence on mise-en-scène, narrative address and symbolic impact. And these are some of the works that that they've studied closely in the past. You'll see a lot of the examples from American and European cinema, but increasingly I want to include, as the literature expands, and, you know, for some of the, obviously the reasons that Josh is talking about, the fabulous and fascinating colour films from a much more global landscape, you know, that I really want to develop the course in that direction. So in terms of methods, it has some fairly traditional methods. It has lectures which introduce the students to the range of examples, as well as key debates and contexts of colour cinema, from feature films to experimental work, just to sort of get them thinking chromatically, as it were, in terms of encountering films. And we have seminars, which are the traditional structure, which provide a forum for the scrutiny of the films and the key literature, as well as to debate colour, generally gain knowledge in a range of contexts, and sort of set exercises so that they can be as simple as, you know, talking about discussing the influence of one particular colour and where they might have encountered it. So it begins with a fairly personal resonance, you know, even as simple as students wanting to talk about their favourite colour and why it's been important to them in the past or whatever. So, you know, at the beginning, it's not aiming too high. They read bachelor's book, chromophobia and things like that. But I do make them step up as the weeks go by and set them more complex exercises and readings, and particularly some of the technical ones and some of the more philosophical ones, and really try to get their learning curve rising about that. Workshops, of course, are important because of the practical work. So these basically try to involve practical engagement with colour, as well as a consideration of how colour is deployed in everyday life, in the environment or within artworks. So often I'll get them to respond, go to a gallery and go see a painting and then respond to it and make a little video about why they were affected by the colour and what they noticed of the colour in this painting. So I've actually found that the students really love doing that sort of kind of the personal register of colour, which I think is really important. And sometimes we forget that it is something that, you know, certainly I think is really important to all of us and affects our lives in different ways, and how they encounter it in the environment. You know, what does the colour look, what are the colours used in you know, railway stations or you know, stores, things like that. So that trying to get them to think chromatically about where they are, the world with which they are interacting. And so they then have to, the final practical group project is designed to invite a more advanced engagement with the possibilities of creating colour in the camera and in post-production. So it requires students to think about colour creatively, as well as in relation to the range of film examples and academic texts they encounter. So some of the challenges and advantages I thought it might just be useful to whip through here, and I can talk about some of those in more detail in the discussion time. But linking of theory and practice is both a challenge and an advantage. You know, it's getting them, it gives them a wider box of tools to sort of explore colour with, other than reading and viewing and thinking and talking. I think the actual practical engagement is they find exciting, and I think it does bring out things that perhaps the other modes don't necessarily do. But of course, it's a challenge. You have to have adequate technical support. You have to have the equipment, and we have honed structures for assessing practical work to account for an individual's contribution when they've been working in a group project. There are modes that track their individual contribution, but also that mark for the whole work, for the film itself. So you sort of avoid those problems of some students saying, oh, well, so and so didn't do enough work, and we're all let down by that particular thing. Time and resources. So you need ideally, quite a long time. You can't just do this in a few weeks. Ideally, you would have it over two semesters rather than squashed into one. But I think the advantages are this creative engagement. I think a greater understanding of practical choices and aesthetic outcomes. I think it allows you to do a great sort of number of comparative exercises. So you can do things like how would the same scenario look, but presented according to different color palettes, and what would the result be if you're using a higher key in red or blue or whatever for the same basic scenario. So that can often be really interesting. You can do a variety of forms: fiction, video essay, genre experimentation, and I think it really does give a sort of acquisition of practical skills and real world training. And they're all terribly excited when they hear that the digital colorist is one of the highest paid. They get highly paid for their work in post-production. So that whole area of post-production is really key in the real world of filmmaking. So I want to finish just with an example of one of the exercises that was sort of one of these intermediate exercises that was based around the Yellow Wallpaper, the short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, published in 1892, which I'm sure most of you know, about a woman's confinement by her physician husband in a room with yellow wallpaper. And her depressed psychological condition deteriorates as the wallpaper appears to mutate, and she begins to see patterns emerging from it, including the figure of a woman who she feels compelled to help by ripping the wallpaper from the wall. So it's a very important short story, and it has been very influential as a sort of meditation on women's experience in the Victorian period. So it's set off to kind of, this is an exercise. They don't actually have to do it because they're going to do their own ideas for their own short film, but it's because you can do a lot of scoping out without actually always having to do the practice. So in this case, students were asked to generate ideas for a short film, and these are the questions that I listed here, the ones that I asked them to think about. So they had to sort of think about what approach they'd take towards the ideas in the story, how they might adapt it, what would be the opportunities and challenges, creative, aesthetic, and technical, of working with this kind of material. Would you just take one element of it? In what genre would you work? How could colour be included in the design in ways that involve more than the yellow, which is such an important element of its chromatic impact? So obviously they would really have to think about the role of yellow in relation to the other colours that they would be using. And what further research would you need to do for your film? Which aspects would you actually choose to sort of highlight? And which theoretical ideas about colour might be usefully applied to this story, and how would they influence your film? So we had really, great discussions about this, and the students came up with all sorts of interesting ideas, and they were bringing in stuff from that they'd read and films they'd seen, and got them to think about yellow, which often isn't necessarily foregrounded as the colour of interest as much as, say, blue or red. So it set them on the trail, the creative trail. So in this case, they didn't make the film, but the idea was intended to generate creative thinking about what they would do for their own projects, which could be based on another media form, a painting or a story, or it could just be, you know, something else. It could be a fiction, could be documentary. It was open, and they are very short films, no more than 10 minutes. Most of them chose colour as the focus of their film, one particular colour, and they worked in groups. Yeah, so that was my experience. Other ideas for teaching methods with colour increasingly are video essays, which I think allow an even greater, you know, engagement, slightly different, more tied to more explicitly tied to the literature, etc. And it's a growing option for students as a means of engaging with ideas and themes they've come across in literature and films and TV and media that they're seeing. So okay, so I'll stop there. So stop the share. Okay.
Thank you so much. It's a brilliant practical example of how students might be asked to engage with colour practice and different technical and aesthetic aspects of it. It's fantastic. Thank you. I shall now introduce our next speaker, who's Dr. Lida Zeitlin-Wu, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Michigan. Her presentation today is on colour, race and technology in the digital studies classroom. She'll be talking about the class that she's taught for the past 2 years at Michigan, which is called From Prisms to Pantone, Colour, Race and Technology, and it's cross-listed between digital studies, film, TV, radio, architecture and American studies. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen. Is everybody seeing that image okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to Liz and Vicky and Sarah for organizing and for inviting me to participate in this exciting and dynamic session about teaching color. Pedagogy is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion after. So I just want to start with saying that I am coming from a slightly different point of orientation from the other presenters today, as someone who is not primarily grounded in film studies, although my PhD is from a film and media studies program. And at the University of Michigan, I'm currently based in the Digital Studies Institute, which is not a department, but an interdisciplinary center that brings together both scholars and practitioners from nearly every discipline in the humanities, as well as the School of Information, the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, the School of Art and Design, and even the College of Engineering. So very interdisciplinary space. And for the past 2 years, I have had the absolute privilege of designing and teaching what I consider to be my dream course based on my own research. And this is an upper division elective called From Prisms to Pantone, Color, Race, and Technology. And I taught this most recently in the fall of 2023. So I've now taught it twice. And I'll return to this slide, but I do just want to quickly say that for context, that this was actually one of several courses offered through the DISCO network, which is a cross-campus research group I'm affiliated with that is dedicated to imagining anti-racist and anti-ableist digital futures. So you can see these courses are all very different, but they share certain investments in looking at social and technical inequities. So my course was a deep dive into this topic of color, spanning all the way from, the Bauhaus to AI. And one of the strands of this class, I think, in a different way, but also I think similar to what Josh was talking about, is the way that color and race are intimately intertwined, and specifically the ways in which color technologies have historically been calibrated to privilege whiteness and fair skin tones. I had virtually no limitations or restrictions on course design, assignments, or assessment, which made it possible to really take a more experimental approach, both with content, but also pedagogy and alternate forms of grading and assessment. And I am coming from the US context. My understanding is that assessment is a bit more standardized in the UK, but it was the case here that I could sort of do what I wanted. What I'd like to do in the short time we have is I'd like to walk you through from Prisms to Pantone, its structure, its goals, how this might expand our understanding of teaching color and also race in an intermedial and interdisciplinary context. And from there, I'll shift to talking more specifically about pedagogy and share with you an assignment I found especially successful. And I'm more than happy to share the syllabus or any assignments by request. Feel free to follow up over email if you're interested. So one of the things that was particularly challenging, but also rewarding about From Prisms to Pantone is that not only was it cross-listed with so many disciplines, as Liz said in her introduction, but there were also no prerequisites. So this meant that many students were coming from outside the humanities altogether. And they all had encountered color in very different ways. So for example, architecture and design students had primarily encountered color in a kind of foundations course that approached it from mostly a purely formal angle. There were also several business students in the class who prior to taking the class had really just seen color as a marketing tool. And there were plenty of students from computer science and engineering, and some of these people were taking the class for their humanities requirement and were not necessarily excited about the material. But there were also others who came to the class with an interest in, for example, game design or algorithmic bias. And so I won't go into it at length now, but one of the activities I began with was thinking about color beyond the symbolic, because many of these students had mostly been exposed to color in high school English classes in which they sort of see color as being this kind of simple answer key. Black means death and red means lust. And so we kind of tried to give them tools to think about color outside of this framework. And I also realized very early on that given the students' varying backgrounds and needs, it made the most sense to conceive of this class as a multimodal one and to work individually with students to come up with creative projects in consultation with me based on their skill sets and interests. So they could do an academic paper if they wanted, but because I hadn't given them the writing background for writing in the humanities, I encouraged them to do the creative route a bit like what Sarah was discussing. So I had students who created zines, podcasts, experimental films, video essays, and so on. And like my research more broadly, this class took a very long historical approach to the digital. And many of my students kind of expressed surprise that we were looking at objects from the 19th century in a digital studies class. And our readings spanned a wide range of disciplines. So in a given week, students might be assigned academic readings, but they might also engage with media objects as wide-reaching as both mainstream and avant-garde films, contemporary artworks, memes, even board games. There was a day when we played this game about color and perception in language called Hues and Cues. Another week, we recreated exercises from Joseph Albers' Interaction of Color and did a sort of meta-reflection on how color theory has been taught in design schools and what this approach might leave out. I was also really lucky due to a course that was actually being taught on color in the art school to be able to borrow color tools used by design industry professionals like the Pantone color checker and the Munsell color tree. And when I brought these tools into the classroom, I wasn't using them necessarily as they were intended, but asking my students to test them out and to point out their affordances and limitations and encouraging them to adopt a healthy skepticism when it comes to technologies that position themselves as objective or a direct reflection of reality. And doing so, teaching them to think about media and how they create meaning through a set of historically specific formal and cultural codes. But just as I wanted students to be critical thinkers, I also pushed the idea that positive experimentation and play, both inside and outside the classroom, were important ways of expanding one's knowledge. So in the time remaining, I'll just walk you through one particularly playful assignment that I found particularly successful. And while it's a fairly specific assignment, I think maybe it points to some various ways that color can be experimented with in the classroom. So one of the main themes of From Prisms to Pantone was the commercialization and privatization of color that we see with global corporations like Pantone. And together, my students and I explored the history of the company, how it came to hold such a monopoly on something as subjective as color, and how its color of the year, which many of you are probably familiar with, tends to rely on often very saccharine or apolitical language that presents color as a sort of panacea for the ills of digital capitalism. So on this slide, there's some examples of colors of the year and some excerpts from press releases that you can see have a very sort of formulaic and repetitive way of describing color. So taking inspiration from design interventions that parody Pantone as a form of social critique, like Jack and Hui's Bleached Coral, which was a commentary on climate change after Pantone released Living Coral, and graphic designer David Bellow's United Colors of the Apocalypse, which is a bit more recent. I created an assignment that asked students to come up with their own color of the year. So it was called Pantone's 2023 color of the year is really ... To ask them to come up with their own color of the year that spoke to a cultural or socio-political phenomenon from the past calendar year. And it could really be whatever they wanted, as long as it was using the visual and verbal language of Pantone to kind of comment on the commodification of color and perform some kind of social critique. So there were two components, a Photoshop component, a mock press release, and then a reflection in which they walked me through their thought process. And Sarah mentioned one of the challenges of doing practical work is having the resources. And so in this case, I am not particularly skilled at Photoshop, and I was really lucky that the Shapiro Design Lab at Michigan had a staff member who even created a whole Photoshop tutorial specifically for this assignment. So I worked with this person to develop that. So I'll just share quickly some assignments I thought were particularly successful. These are actually from the first time I taught this course in winter 2023. So you can already see this is dated because this was before Twitter became X. So this student did a parody of Verification Blue. I love the ending. It says, globally inoffensive and relatable, Verification Blue now stands for equality and freedom to spread misinformation as long as they have a reliable internet connection, a personal device, and pay $8 a month. And I like the way they sort of play around with blue and the sky as well. And this other student did a kind of meta commentary on fast fashion by creating fast fashion fuchsia. And she even created a kind of pretend line of Pantone products. And so what I'm showing you doesn't include the reflection that connects this to topics in the course. But overall, I think this kind of gives students a way of engaging both with the writing side and also the visual side of color, and to kind of think beyond these more purely kind of symbolic ways of thinking color. So overall, I think color is a challenging but extremely rewarding topic to teach. By the end of the course, many students said they would never see color the same way. And I think this is the most I can ask of myself as an instructor, because I want my students to come away from my courses questioning the things they once thought were normal or routine, and I want them to leave the classroom and see the world anew. So thank you. I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. It's another amazing presentation. Very fortunate to hear so many brilliant different approaches today. I will introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Kirsty Sinclair Dootson. She's a lecturer in media and film at the University College London. Kirsty's research explores material and technical history of modern visual media. Her recent work has focused on colour, particularly the global exchange of colour film technologies in the post-war period. Her most recent book, I'm saying that, there'll be another, is called Rainbow's Gravity, and it was published by the Paul Mellon Centre 2023. And today she's going to be speaking about decentering film history through colour. Kirsty.
Thanks so much, Liz. Right, I'm just going to do the technological bit of sharing my slides. Okay, can everyone see those?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect, great. So yeah, thank you so much, Liz and Vicky and Sarah, for putting this together. This is such a useful form of group therapy at the end of term for me personally. It's also so great to be speaking with people who, everyone on this panel I teach in my colour course. So that's also a kind of nice meta feedback loop. And I also was very lucky to inherit Josh's colour course when I worked at the University of St Andrews, that because he put this course on the books. I inherited that when I got there, which was a pleasure. So I have called my talk Decentering Film History Through Colour, but since submitting that title, I've added a question mark and a subtitle. So it's now Decentering Film History Through Colour. Because as I was preparing this talk, again, as I say, this is a form of therapy for me. I kind of started building in caveats and questions and problems. And I also added the caveat, how I learned to stop worrying and love technological history. Because as I will go on to explain, I'm trying to think through how teaching technological histories of cinema or film color can help not resolve, but kind of tackle some of the issues around teaching film color. So when I submitted that title, I was thinking both, how can color help us kind of globalize or decenter film history modules? So for people who teach the big survey, how could incorporating color kind of help you kind of globalize or decenter those histories that can so often be kind of oriented around Hollywood and European models? And this is one of the great things about working on color, and I think everyone will agree, is that it feels like this passport to everywhere, that you're entitled to talk about anything in color, so you can use anything as an example, even black and white things, but that also comes with its limitations and problems. So I also wanted to think about how can we kind of globalize and decenter our color film modules as well, and particularly someone who works on technological history, as I'll sort of talk about. So the challenges, and I'll try, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, I'll try and not talk about the challenges and problems too much. So I've put up top the perceived centrality of visual analysis and aesthetics, which doesn't immediately seem to be a problem, but this relates to something that Lida was saying about a kind of assumption of students that come into classes on color. And just to say, I teach a module at UCL called Global Film Color, what was at St Andrews Film Technology and Aesthetics, which was Josh's course. So I think students come into the classroom and think they're going to get exactly what Lida described, which is we're going to learn how to crack the code. We're going to be able to watch a film and know what color means. Like, this color's doing this color's doing that. And there's a real assumption that the main thing we're going to be doing is visual analysis, kind of textual analysis, and talking about style and aesthetics. Now, this can be great, but this also produces a problem related to that idea of color being a passport to anywhere, that students then get very hung up because they want to know these kind of symbolic or, coded meanings of color. They can get very hung up on understanding the cultural contingency of color in the examples that we're watching. So while color allows you to teach films to give examples from my course, Senegal, Kenya, China, Japan, students then, because they really want to do the kind of color decoding, become stuck on, but I don't understand all of the nuances of the cultural symbolism of color in this particular time and place. Some of the other challenges, of course, with kind of the aesthetic and visual analysis approach is being reliant on high quality films available in digital copies with English subtitles, with related scholarship in English. So, it's great that we have, to give an example, Gate of Hell, recently digitally restored. It looks fantastic, and Sarah has published wonderful scholarship on it. So it's this perfect teaching package of movie and scholarship that you can teach. But this isn't the case for film from all over the world, right? I'm going to think a little bit more about that when I get to my case study. There's also, as we've kind of talked about, the Western centricity of color theory And I would love to hear from other people about kind of decentering theories of color as well. Something I'm not a theoretician, but that's something that I struggle with, is incorporating color theory from outside of Europe or the US. Color nomenclature and technological history. So these are all kind of oriented around kind of Western perceptions. So just to give you an example about nomenclature. So what I often get students to do in class, actually, sorry, you can tell it's the last week of term. I'm jumping around all over the place. At the bottom here, I've got, instead of solving these problems, can we get students to reflect on them, right? So there are all these problems, and I've taken up half of my time talking about the problems of teaching color. And I certainly do not have the solution to these problems, but there are ways to get students to become aware of them and reflect on them, in order to not be kind of, not see them as just obstacles that prevent us from doing this work, right? So one of them, thinking about the kind of Western centricity of color nomenclature, and as Josh and Lida have been talking about, the profound entanglement of the terminology we used to talk about color with processes of racialization, colonization, empire. So something I often do with students is I use randomcolor.com. It brings up a random color. Here are 3 that it threw up when I was making my slides. And I asked them in the space of a minute to come up with every synonym for this color that they can think of, like every single color term. And then we collect them and we go through them and think about, okay, how are the words that you're using to describe this color related to histories of colonial extractivism, enslavement, as well as, nature, culture, these other things. So that's one way to get them to reflect on that early, because I often find when I get essays in at the end of term, there's quite this, if I don't do this, there can be this sort of unreflective use of color nomenclature. So the other way to think about the sort of Western centricity of technological history, right? This is personal to me in that I primarily teach film technology. Let me just skip through. Here's the kind of rough syllabus for my global film color module. And so the first half of the course is a kind of chronological history through the kind of major technologies, which largely derive from Europe, the US. The second half, which I won't talk about, are kind of critical themes. So thinking about the entwinement of color, race, gender, sensuality, and that's taught through individual colors. So black and white, pink, red, blue. But the technological history, the problem is, if you want to teach this kind of straightforward chronological technological history, a lot of these technologies emerge from the US or Europe and then arrive elsewhere in the world, right? So how do we overcome this issue of kind of technological belatedness, or only teaching those kind of demonstration moments of the first 3-strip Technicolor film in Hollywood, right? So what I try to do is think about films that produce moments of encounter, kind of global encounter, to try and kind of problematize or reflect on some of these challenges. So going back to, this is a case study for, this is how I teach Technicolor. So obviously it's very tempting to teach Technicolor through British cinema or US cinema, partially because I've written about this in my book. I teach Jhansi Ki Rani, or The Tiger and the Flame, which is India's only 3-strip Technicolor film, kind of made by an Indian producer and director. And I choose this film precisely to reflect on those issues that I mentioned before around how we tend to write histories around well-preserved films in good quality. As you can see here, Jhansi Ki Rani looks terrible. So the Hindi version of the film is only available in black and white. The English language version is available on this terrible DVD that I think is ripped from VHS. And so this desire for the students to do visual analysis, when they're confronted with an object like Jhansi Ki Rani, they're like, but I can't, it looks terrible. And then the question is, but does that mean we shouldn't study it, right? Like, what are some other ways we could think about this film that aren't just doing textual analysis of costumes, makeup, et cetera, et cetera? And this kind of forces them to kind of put those textual analysis questions to one side for a moment. It's not that they're not important. We do them elsewhere in the module. But to think about what are we missing by privileging close textual analysis, and what histories could we be telling if we watch kind of poor quality color films? I realize I'm at time, so I'm gonna stop there and move on to hear from Bregt, who I'm excited to hear from. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. That's brilliant. I look forward to coming back and with you discussing it, and just after our final speaker. We welcome Dr. Bregt Lameris. She is Senior Lecturer at the Department of Digital Culture, Innovation and Communication at the Open University in Netherlands. She'll be speaking today about teaching colour and the materiality of film, which she'll be elaborating on teaching the history of colour and film through experimental media archaeology, based on her experiences with a tinting and toning workshop for film students at the Zurich University at the Leipzig Kinemathek in Bern. Over to you, Bregt.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's just amazing to be lined up with all these great scholars. I'm feeling a bit modest. Let me get my presentation here. Yes, indeed. My presentation will cover a workshop that we organized within the context of a larger course called Materiality of Film, which we taught at the Lichtspiel in Bern, indeed, which is kind of an archive that has this laboratory way. So, but today I will focus on mostly on the color workshop and give you a bit of theoretical background that I used to kind of understand what we were doing. And if it's, I will try to be as clear as possible, but if it's not, you can read it also in the moving image from 2019, edited by Josh. And in the forum part, Teaching the Materiality of Film, which I co-authored with Barbara Flückiger. We also co-taught the course together, but also with the people from the Lichtspiel, who did all kinds of amazing things, teaching the students how to project films, analog films, and all that kind of, and also really study the color on the film material, etc. But I won't be talking about that today. I'll be talking about something else. And for this, I will start going back and forth a bit in kind of like reflection on the materiality of film in a digital age. Because with the upcoming digital technology, people have been feeling the urge to go back to the materiality of film, photography. I mean, my husband has built a developing photo developer thing in the shed. So I experienced this in my daily life. And but also historians have felt that they were missing something with digital sources. So Richard Abel, for example, explained that he missed the feeling of having been in the archive, which is kind of reminding us of Roland Barthes' AET, so there has been there-ness. And this has also been used in this wonderful book by Carolyn Steedman, Dust. It's a bit older now, from 2001, which refers to physical presence of the historian in the archive. And she writes, but really it comes from having been there, the train to the distant city, the call number, the bundle opened, the dust, so that then and only then you can present yourself as a moved and dictated to by those sources, telling a story the way it has to be told. So this having been there, touching the sources, is what gives a historian authority apparently, but also kind of like this feeling that I will discuss further, this affective type of history with historical sensation. So a lot of years ago with Vicky, we gave a talk on affective history actually. And I'm borrowing a bit from that because we discussed an article that was called Touching the Void, Affective History and the Impossible by Emily Robinson. And she asserted in this article that historical research is an affective experience, and that being able to touch and sever, smell the archival documents is a powerful affective experience, which deserves far greater analysis than it has received up to now. Moreover, the affective aspects of historical research are an important aspect of our work in numerous ways, which can influence the research questions we seek to answer and the historical interpretation of the source materials to the histories we construct. And to give some fundament to her statement, she refers to the Dutch writer and literary critic from the 19th century, Lodewijk van Dijssel, who wrote, "Sensation is a mutual embrace of subject and object in which each gives itself completely and unreservedly to the other. Moreover, unlike the eye, the sense of touch really adapts itself to what it experiences. Think again of feeling the form of a vase that we hold in our hands. So when we feel the vase's form, because our hands take on the very same form as the vases, we are formed by what we perceive. What we perceive leaves its indelible traces on us." It's a very phenomenological approach in a way, avant la lettre. He was the mentor, this writer, Lodewijk van Dijssel, of the well-known, probably you know him as well, but in the Netherlands everybody knows him, who is interested in cultural history, Johan Huizinga. Huizinga, maybe you understand what I say then. In the first half of the 20th century, Huizinga further shaped this idea of being close to the sources as an important experience to his concept of the historical sensation, which he is famous for. Another Dutch historian and philosopher, Frank Ankersmit, who bases himself on Huizinga very strongly, further developed this idea of the historical sensation. And to him, the experience of the authenticity of the past was the direct experience of reality, so precognitive, affective reaction to what we encounter in our sources, before language gets access to our perception. So following Van Dijssel and Huizinga, Ankersmit continues his thinking with this focus on the touch and the vase and the hands and the shape of the object, and then goes to the idea that touch is the most direct of the senses, with the phenomenological idea that the subject always changes when being touched by an object and touching an object at the same time. So the object leaves an imprint on the subject and as a result changes the subject, the historian, the student, and experiencing this imprint produces Bildung, according to Ankersmit. He's very philosophical guy. In all, historical sensation to Ankersmit is the process of the mind of the historian forming itself under the influence of what it experiences. And this results in this Bildung, forming, shaping of the mind. And according to Ankersmit, changes occur in our historical organ of touch, enabling direct contact to the past. And this is why this sensation and the direct encounter of the historical sources is an important factor of being a good historian. Well, okay, that can be discussed, but we want to kind of like pick up this embodied experience of the historical work, of the work of an historian. And this kind of was picked up by Andreas Vickers and Annie van der Oever, who actually, Annie works at the same university as Frank Ankersmit and worked with him as well. And she, with Andreas Vickers, then developed another kind of hands-on methodology for history, which she called, with Andreas Vickers, experimental media archaeology. And this methodology works with the idea of the historical reenactment, producing knowledge in a more physical way, and not necessarily only studying written sources and analyze them, but really touching, smelling the objects from the past. So the enactment is introduced into their research method. the philosophies behind the integration of this method, they lay out in their article Experimental Media Archaeology, a plea for new directions. So they want to turn the archives into laboratories, which actually the Lichtspiel, as I said, already kind of did, and produce embodied knowledge, so different types of knowledge. Here's the Lichtspiel to show you how kind of like cramped it is with objects, and these objects are, most of them are functional. They can be handled sometimes by the visitors themselves, or they are used for presentation. They still project their 16 and 8mm films on analog projectors. They have all these kind of like scopitones, which you can see there in the corner on the left of the image. So it is a place where you can, and there's no cords, there's no glass being in between like the visitor and the object. So everybody can touch and smell and experience the dustiness or the oiliness of these objects, which makes it a perfect place for such a course on, first of all, the materiality of film, but then also for the workshop on the color, the materiality of color. So, yeah. So for the workshop, we invited Ulrich Rudel, the professor for conservation and restoration of modern media at the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, who is also well known for organizing the color conferences and yeah, for being a nice person and for being a good restoration professional. And he is a chemist, analytical chemist, and a film archivist historian, applying historical techniques of tinting and toning in a modern setting for his research, but also then for the students when he invited him, and also organizing workshops elsewhere, I think. Yeah. So this is a way to teach then this materiality of color based on his experiences with his experiments and the knowledge he gained while doing these experiments with these old, now obsolete technologies. And giving these workshops allowed, of course, these students and others to directly experience how these monochrome colors were added to black and white film until the late 1920s. So that's kind of like early film color technology. We're not going to try to make a Technicolor film there. So here we see that basically there were some concessions. The differences between like the old practice and what we were doing in the workshop is that we didn't use long film strips, not entire films, because that's practically not doable. So we use short, small snippets of film to work on and to experiment with these color technologies. And then it's done in a more laboratory setting because the machines, etc., used for this aren't there anymore. Furthermore, we did not use nitrate, with some small exceptions, because Brigitte Pavlovic, who was still working at the Lichtspiel by then, kind of did sneak in some nitrate to experiment with, but most of it was acetate and polyester. So that already reacts differently to the dyes and the chemicals. And then the emulsions that the modern material has less silver than those in the teens and 20s, so they react differently to the dyes and the chemicals for the toning. So what Uli and what the students doing his experiments or reenacting kind of like the process of coloring black and white film learned was how complex this process was, basically, especially the toning and the toning processes were extremely complex. plus that many of historical dyes are not available anymore. We know that for sure, because some are toxic, but many are also simply not there anymore. So what Uli does is use food dyes because they are allowed, and it works. And then it needs time. So you need to be patient. And that's also something that the students definitely learned. So they were mixing, shaking, stirring, waiting for the dyeing, waiting for the bleaching, trying it out because you have to bleach before you can tone. And yeah, waiting for some color to appear. They had to make their hands dirty, but also be careful, follow the recipes. And what they discovered then, of course, what I already mentioned, is that tinting is much easier than toning, because toning is this real chemical process of bleaching and then coupling the dyes with the etc. So if I go into the technical details, I will be here until tomorrow. So basically the workshop was kind of like a hands-on, ears-on, and an integral sensual approach towards this technology of tinting and toning monochrome black and white film into monochrome color. And well, they did also try tinting and toning, but it was not so successful. And creating embodied knowledge, knowing how long it takes, knowing that it's chemical, that it smells, that you have to be careful. And then the archive was turned into a laboratory, although Lichtspiel, we can argue it is already a laboratory. So finally, I can say that we succeeded here in this experimental media archaeology project, a plea for new directions, but then also in teaching. And I couldn't find the English slide, so this says bedankt voor uw aandacht, which is thank you for your attention.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. It's an absolutely fascinating array of different approaches and case studies for teaching colour and film. It's practical and the theoretical coming together there. I'd like to open the floor to our guests, everybody that's attending, Josh is classy, if they have questions for any of our speakers, very welcome to ask. So for those that are online, perhaps type them into the chat box, or else just appear online. Oh, Josh, if you'd like to be conduit for the any questions from your lecture. Yeah, has anybody questions to ask?
Lynn
has a question.
Hi. Thank you so much. I mean, I just want to be a student again and do all these courses because, you know, they just look amazing. I come from a different discipline, a kind of art history, and very much a kind of cultural studies, a cultural history, that's actually important, a cultural history approach to art history. And I thought it was really interesting how you all have slightly different purchases on the importance of cultural contexts or historical contexts. And I can imagine, given the kind of wonderful scope of the content in these courses, it would be quite difficult to do that as well. And I just wondered, you know, if you just got any thoughts, whether it's about, you know, not really an answer about, you know, how important it is, but, you know, is it a problem to kind of integrate that as well? Are students interested in a longer history of colour and so, you know, a question around history? But thank you so much. I really found that fascinating.
Anybody like to respond?
I mean, I can jump in on art history maybe as much as cultural history. And this maybe speaks to Josh and Lida's presentations as well, that I find that when I'm, you know, the entwinements of race and color run throughout the course, but I find that when I'm dedicating a specific week to it, some of the material that I assign is kind of, it's art historical material related to the 18th century, because I feel like art historians working on the 18th century are doing some of the best work in this, present company excluded, of course. And sometimes the students do have questions about, like, why are we reading Anne Lafont? Like, why are we reading a historian of 18th century France, an art historian of 18th century France? Why are we reading about 18th century painting? But when you actually tie that up and say, like, this is when these phenomena get intertwined, like, these are the historical origins, this is the moment. You know, sometimes I like to teach that with Marie Antoinette as well, just for fun. But they do get it, they do care, they do understand it, but there is some resistance initially to go back what for film and media students seems like a long time to the 18th century, right? Not for our historians. But once you kind of, you know, I often show them 18th century paintings of like white portraiture with like enslaved attendant, and say, like, this is the historical precedent of the kind of China girl. Like, here we have the centrality of whiteness next to the kind of demonstration object of color, which might be a bowl of fruit, a peacock, an enslaved person. And that kind of makes something click for the students of like, oh, okay, 18th century painting is relevant to 21st century cinema. But like, there can be that resistance to start with, but, you know, I guess the onus is on us to make that work. And I'm interested to hear from other people on this as well.
I can jump in there. I mean, it's a great question, and yeah, I am not an art historian, but often my objects will overlap with art historians, and I think thinking historically and resisting kind of deterministic narratives of history and technology is really core to both my research and my course. I mentioned briefly in my presentation that some students were surprised that in a digital studies class, we were reading stuff about the 19th century. And I think that's because a lot of courses that are taught through the Digital Studies Institute truly focus on the contemporary. Maybe they really only focus on social media. And for me, what I think is really valuable is to take, because these are students who haven't known a world before the digital, to kind of start with their present day understanding of technology and color, and then kind of think, well, is digital color all that different from analog color, from earlier ways of thinking color? And if it is different, why does that matter? So I think when I bring in the case of my class, I assign Nicholas Gaskill and Michael Rossi. Like, one is a literary scholar, one is a historian of science, but they're both interested in the rise of color science at the turn of the 20th century, and the way that fed into racialized discourses about, you know, quote, primitivism versus civilization, but was also the beginning of a lot of standardized color models that form the basis for our digital screens. So I think a lot of students were interested in learning about the history of that. Although it wasn't a huge focus of the course, I find students are really interested in color blindness, and Rossi's book looks at the history of that pathologization and the way that it actually fed into some conversations around kind of civilized perception and things like that. So I think in the case of my class, the historical distinction is really giving the students the tools to talk about how color operates differently. So I think similar to Kirsty, a lot of discussion about technological affordances and differences, the certain materials or technologies that make possible a certain way of understanding color. And so when I ask my students to use Photoshop for an assignment, I'm not asking them just to use it as a tool, but actually to reflect on, what does Photoshop allow me to do with color that, say, a pigment-based palette wouldn't? But yeah, it's something I think about a lot. I don't know if others want to weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm the same. I think the way that the course that I teach is structured is that I really want students to engage with colour in other media, what understandings have been around those media. I suppose the element of the practical can sometimes detract a bit from the deeper reading that the students might otherwise be doing if, you know, they were really delving into the relationship between the painting that's inspired them for their practical exercise. And but that being said, the better students, I think, will kind of really want to.
You know, I thought the practical elements were just fantastic, because you just learn so much in that way. Well, yeah, you know that, but yeah, I mean, that's why I think it's such a balancing act, isn't it, between that kind of material understanding and then a kind of historical appreciation or whatever.
And I really, Kirsty, I really kind of chime with what you said about they seem so concerned in the beginning to have like fixed color meanings, and they find it quite disturbing when you say, well, no, color is relational, color is profoundly contingent on other things. It's contingent on, you know, and influenced by, you know, religion, race, political cultures, different periods, you know, the complexity of it. I think you have to take a while for them to accept that that's actually something really stimulating and kind of fascinating to probe, rather than being a barrier to sort of stopping them wanting to sort of do that difficult work. And I think the practical work can help with that, because they can just get carried along with really engaging with, well, why would I put that color there? Why did somebody do that? Why is color having this? Why is yellow having this meaning in this particular story in such a way that is very different from what I understand? But yeah.
I guess I would just say that, kind of echoing what everybody else has already said, that, you know, we're all historians of media on this call in various ways. And, you know, part of the kind of push with color is that it's so expansive and can take us in so many different directions through our expertise and beyond. And, you know, every day when like we're teaching, like we're always kind of confronted with, I think, with color and with the other things that we teach, like the limitations of our own knowledge as a point of departure to some extent, that it helps us to kind of continue to kind of push into newer areas of knowledge. And, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, the kind of some of the opening conversations about like non-Western color theory, which, you know, I'm not an expert on, but it's also kind of a motivation to think, okay, what does that mean to decolonize the way in which we're thinking about color and thinking about its history? What are methods and tools that we can deploy and that we can draw from and help our students to deploy to open up like new questions and new ways of expanding the kind of media history that we're dealing with here. And, you know, I'm really kind of fortunate to teach in an institution that has a, you know, a large number of international students that bring in all kinds of expertise from around the world. And, you know, as other people have said, across disciplines as well. I'm thinking about what Lida was saying about like all the different kind of majors that are coming into her course. And that's, on the one hand, you know, it limits certain directions you can go in, but also expands how you can bring new tools and methods to the table to kind of open up these questions that we're all grappling with. So, you know, that's where I would begin, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I can add that, well, I really enjoyed the assignment you described, Sarah. And I think these kind of, and also the one with the Pantone colors that you have, and also yours, Kirsty, with the let's name these colors, huh? And just kind of like these practical things. I think that they, of course, you do not do that separate from the theory and the history and everything, but it makes things resonate, I think, physically maybe. So in that perspective, it is important to have both. And then, of course, yeah, historical context can be like this or like this, or triangles or whatever. So that's always, yeah, the choice you have to make. Yeah.
Maybe if there isn't a question, I was going to ask, people, if they've had the experience, I mean, in Bristol, we often have quite these big team taught courses, so that, you know, there'll be a film history course or whatever. So, you know, you may only do 1 or 2 lectures. And I often find that really difficult because it's the complete opposite of the in-depth course that takes time, and there's multiple ways that you can engage students in colour, but I've always wanted to include colour and always want to in a film history course. So I was just wondering, you know, obviously do 1 lecture or whatever, but if people had any kind of reflections on just what you have to do in that 1 session to I don't know, is it too limiting, or is it nevertheless worth it, even if it's a tiny element of a much larger teaching experience? I mean, do other people do that, or do you just teach your colour course and then the other general teaching, it's you can't really fit it in?
Well, having taught both in the UK and the United States, you know, I've had that experience of like, you know, teaching the week or 2 on a module. And have I taught color? I probably did teach color back at St. Andrews when I did that, like at some point. And you know, there's different strategies and different goals for like that kind of like one-off lecture versus like a whole kind of course that you're able to kind of expand on. But you know, I think there's always, you know, conversations to be had, even like in those single one-offs or, you know, 2-week kind of things that you might do that, you know, engage the students like specifically with color in ways that, you know, relate to the broader kind of contours of the course. I would say one thing I'd like to do more, and we've been having some conversations at Michigan State, but about like kind of more co-teaching kind of, but not in the massive modular kind of sense, but like you know, a whole course that's kind of co-taught and is about kind of the kind of dialogic relationship between the instructors with the students. And you know, I'd love to be able to, you know, again, thinking about the limitations of my own knowledge and expertise, to bring in people who complement that. In, you know, if Uli Rudel was here and could teach chemistry in conjunction with the stuff on color, or, you know, any one of you, like that would be fantastic. But, you know, we're, you know, my department's thinking through ways of kind of doing that, which is always complicated. But, you know, I would love to kind of do that as a means of kind of expanding and diversifying the content.
I can talk a little about co-teaching, because having taught as a grad student at UC Berkeley for 7 years, our go-to format was co-teaching. And sometimes that was wonderful and sometimes it was terrible. But it often involved 2 graduate students coming up with a topic when the graduate students in question might have wildly different research interests, and making it at the same time legible as what it was, which is a first year kind of intro writing class. So I never taught a color course because I was always working with somebody who had other interests. So I found ways to like sneak color in. So I remember I taught a course called TV After TV with a friend of mine who is primarily a television scholar. And we taught Pleasantville, which is a film that takes TV as a major focus. But of course, as you all know, color and color as race and hue is such a big part of the film that I was able to at least make that discussion of that particular media object relevant. And then there were students who were like, this is really interesting, and it piqued my interest about color. Or I taught co-taught another course about kind of good and bad taste and media. And so I thought, okay, I'll rope in, you know, David Batchelor and talk about chromophobia. So I think there are ways to gesture towards a larger conversation within an existing course. But that said, I would love the opportunity to team teach a course on color with someone who works on color in a different way, whether that means a different historical or geographic context. And I think the way I've done it so far is by having guest lectures, which has worked well. Of course, you have to have funding for that, but the idea of like bringing in someone from chemistry would be, I mean, I hadn't even thought of that, but from the sciences could be really interesting as well.
I would jump in and say, so I do the sort of color week on the survey, which when I arrived at UCL, I found it very funny that I was told, oh, we have like our, you know, the survey, and then we have this bit called hidden histories. And they're like, so you can teach a hidden history of color. And I was like, it's not hidden. Like, we all know about it. But I do a lecture that's like, here's the technological history of color, right? So like, let's start with the Serpentine dance films, and we're going up to, you know, the late 20th century. And I like, the only way to kind of navigate through that is some kind of continuity, some kind of thread. So dance becomes one of them. So starting with Serpentine dance, going through the red shoes, and then obviously, because it's me, ending up with the red detachment of women, right? So it's this way of finding some kind of continuity of dance and movement, and how does this become intertwined with moments of like color demonstration, or, you know, but doing that big survey of here's the whole history of color cinema from, you know, the silent up to kind of monopack. I usually end up at Pleasantville as well by the time it gets digital, but finding that through line as well, I think, and there's so many things that you can find, right? Again, this is sort of like as I think we keep coming back to, like, the great thing about color is it takes you everywhere in all these directions, but that means you have to kind of rein it in some capacity. I also, just to throw this out, and I don't want to derail Sarah's question, but just before I forget this, has anyone had the experience of having a colorblind student in class, which I had at St Andrews, and I just was interested in if anyone else has had this experience of how that like forces you to teach color different. Okay, no, yeah, nobody else. Just coming back to the, you know, Rossi's work on colorblindness.
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe mildly colorblind, but I also wonder if that doesn't somehow, like, if it's an elective, especially if students self-select. But I try to, I mean, disability studies is not my area, but through my postdoc, I've learned a lot more about disability studies and kind of best practices in the classroom. And, you know, things like universal design, where they say, oh, you should use these kinds of colors for slides. It's like, how do you do that in a class about color? And I think the only way is to bring conversations around visual acuity into the classroom. So I did have my students take the, whatever it's called, the Munsell, the Farnsworth, the you know, the Hue test, and not as a way of like me diagnosing them with anything, but to kind of reflect on, you know, what are the parameters of this test. And I've had students do projects on color blindness. I had a student who interviewed her boyfriend who was colorblind. Yeah. And I had somebody else, don't believe he was colorblind, or maybe minorly, like not in an extreme way, but created this great comic about color blindness in video games and video game design. But yeah, I've never had a student who was just straight up like, the reds look like greens or something like that.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked that this student declared this halfway through the term as well. They didn't say at the beginning. But it made me reflect on, again, coming back to sort of what I was talking about, sort of decentering textual analysis, which again, like coming from art history, feels so central. This made me think like, oh, there's so many other ways that you can engage with this material that do not actually require you to be able to do sequence analysis. But I was interested to hear if anyone else had that experience or had come up with kind of different solutions. But yeah, that's super interesting, Lida. Like, your students sound amazing.
Oh,
Liz, you're muted.
Sound is off.
Just realised. Sorry. I can see we're approaching 5:30, 17:29. So I just wonder if there are any other questions quickly, or else we must that out. This is our scheduled end time. So I just wonder if there are any other questions. Then please signal now. I'll put them in the chat. And it's been fascinating thinking about some of those examples in particular, where you move from something where color is integral to the image, part of the telling of the film, but also has that diegetic function, like Dust the Dust and Pleasantville, which is like fascinating to think through the kind of the maneuvers that color makes in those films. So if there are any other questions, otherwise our final thing is to thank our speakers. So thank you so much for joining us today and for telling us about your teaching color. It's an absolutely fantastic